Thunderstruck by Merlos the Mad. Chapter 7 Beautiful Mammal. Lines of code and digitized information scrolled across Sweetie Belle's consciousness. She didn't understand it all, but it was still there, and it told her almost everything she did know. It was a strange sort of understanding, like realizing something on intuition or instinct alone, or just barely remembering a faded memory. But more important to her than all of that silly stuff was what was transpiring right that instant. The cat that had at first been a delightful curiosity, and then proved to be a flagellant enemy, was just sitting on the other side of the article-designated recliner. Sure, the feline was very pretty, but also a force to be reckoned with. Sweetie Belle eased back on her haunches ever so quietly and carefully. Her motors were rather loud, something she thought she could improve easily were she to figure out the means. But for now, her prey awaited. Sweetie studied the cat through the reflection of the room's television. The cat did not seem to be very clever, only fierce, as it did not use the same reflection to notice her back. Through trial and error, Sweetie had figured out that the cat has, however, still a worry for a wily foe, especially this one. On top of that, it was mean, and would hiss and attack her for no reason at all that she could think of. What was worse was the fact the creature appeared to be a great deal faster and more nimble than she. Of course, if she had caught the cat, she wasn't sure exactly what she would or could do with it. Sweetie had pondered ways to make peace with the cat, but talking certainly hadn't helped. In fact, after GLaDOS's earlier actions, it was beginning to seem to her that behaving however one wished was the only way to get anything done. After all, the cat did what it wanted and didn't listen in the least. For that matter, GLaDOS had been no help either. After moving around for a little while, she had apparently deactivated, or maybe she had fallen asleep, or possibly had begun to hibernate. Sweetie wasn't really sure what exactly happened to GLaDOS, but she had stopped functioning as before. One definition suggests GLaDOS might have died, she studied, but I don't think that sounds like the one. But I don't think I like the sound of that one. Regardless of the other unhelpful machine, the cat was being just as stubborn, but also dangerous. It was too bad, Sweetie decided. She liked talking, and had thought she had been quite polite, was the word. The cat was not a good talker. In the end, Sweetie decided that the best course of action was to contain the cat. Its reign of terror had gone long enough. Most of the interesting beings and creatures of the house were docile or skittish, but not this cat. The information in her memory claimed all sorts of things about animals. One of those things was the territorial nature of certain species were prone to, which seemed relevant. And that's perfectly optimal, Sweetie thought resolutely. It can just rule from within one of the closets from now on. Her eyelids narrowed a hair, her plan to be executed set in stone. Sweetie opened her eyes fully once again, and abruptly crossed them, confused. "Why did I cross my eyes?" she said aloud. Her mouth opened a fraction in wonder. "I can talk to myself?" "I can talk to myself," she explained. exclaimed in her excitement. Despite that revolution, she couldn't immediately come up with an answer to why she had narrowed her field of vision. Sweetie, can you answer some questions? Why did... Wait, no. No talking out loud to myself wouldn't work any better than thinking. Yes, thinking. She held up a hoof to her chin and hummed. I can't talk to myself as quickly out loud either. Understood. Back to my question. Why did I do that something with my eyes? Yes, that's the question. Sweetie's very own thoughts were proving to be as large of an obstacle as the cat. She thought over the question carefully. One part of her said it was inefficient and made little sense to cross her vision in such a way, as it reduced what she could see. That part of her said not to do it, because it wasn't part of some weird order of things that it kept telling her to do. That part seemed to be the one called programming. As Stephanie had informed her, that part was confusing. Her eyes remained crossed during the entire trade with herself. Unfortunately, her vision couldn't reach back in on her face in such a way that she could see what was going on. There had been some small hope held out that if attempted long enough, that would work. Instead, she uncrossed her eyes and looked over at the television, recalling how she had been able to see herself in it. The reflection of herself was there, still somewhat crouched stealthily beside the chair furniture. Her eyes zoomed in on the metal that made up her outside. No fur? Should I have fur? After turning herself sideways, she decided her body looked even stranger than she had realized previously. Of course, her only basis for what was strange was the other animals in the near vicinity. I'm an animal of sort, aren't I? The thought hung for a moment, suspended in mystery. She kind of looked like them, but also kind of didn't. Sweetie tilted her head, curious for an answer. No, that isn't right, she thought. I'm a... She searched her definitions for a moment. Blurs, words blurred past her mind's eye. Machine. I'm a machine, made of metal and circuitry. Sweetie puzzled the interesting fact out after studying the information that was available. It was odd to her. For some reason, just being able to think of questions and suddenly know the answer sometimes, when other times nothing came at all. She continued down the trail of little thoughts she had found. The other animals possess DNA and were made up of carbon and so much else. Sweetie frowned and looked around. Huh, so where are the other Sweetie Bells? There was GLaDOS, she was a machine. But she was also different. Unlike GLaDOS, the animals didn't talk, but they at least vaguely matched her own four-legged shape. Howl, though, had just was just a mean thing that had wanted to hurt her. Then there was Stephanie. Stephanie spoke to her and talked to her. That made her different. It seemed everything in the building was pretty much different from one another. That seemed odd for some reason. But what is Stephanie then? Sweetie blinked while searching for the right word. Kind, she decided. I remember Stephanie being very, very nice to me. She smiled again, and felt like she should be able to do something else too, but it was a mystery. And what else? Oh, I know. What's outside the building? The sudden presence of a low, feline growl above Stephanie's head caught her by surprise and made her look up. The cameras that made up her eyes widened slightly, focusing. You! She had time to exclaim before the feline atop the chair, which it had done to take her by surprise, jumped down on her head. The cat began hissing furiously. Sweetie cried out and tried to run, but it was too late. Secure on her back was the animal that tormented her. Please, there's no need to fight. We can be friends, she pleaded, all the while trying to reach up with one of her hooves and push it off. The cat answered by raking its claws across her vision. Sweetie reciprocated the cat's hissing back at it in a final attempt to scare it away, but to little discernible effect. I don't like cats. I do not like cats at all. She began to try spinning. Perhaps that would dislodge the creature. But she found her body couldn't move quickly enough for the plan to work. There has to be a better way to deal with cats. The battle raged on, with other animals looking on from the corners of the building. A small table turned over, depositing its articles onto the floor, and added to the growing mess. Unfortunately, the cat remained completely undeterred. After a great deal of tossing it about, bucking, and terror wreaking throughout the building, Sweetie finally got the cat off of her head. Success! Her hoofs clapped loudly on the wood floor as she tried to escape in desperation. Thoughts raced in her mind over what she could do. I must utilize drastic measures, it seems. The carpet slid out from under her as she as she rounded a corner, crashing her into a nearby wall. She lay there a moment surprised, and as soon as I get my bearings. The cat had caught up and proceeded to continue spitting and swiping at Sweetie, despite her being prone and helpless. You just can't stay in there forever. You can just stay in there forever. Sweetie managed to shut the door before the cat could leap back out. It had taken 3 tries, but she finally wrestled the rogue animal into submission and secured it in a separate chamber. The feeling of relief and thankfulness washed over her. Running away hadn't worked at all. The cat kept finding her, and she didn't know how to deal with it. Wrestling with the animal had been just as unpleasant as running from it, and she had to take care not to harm the unreasonable thing. In retrospect, she concluded the cat had been more of an extreme nuisance to her rather than a threat. But she had felt something. The word came to her eventually. It was afraid. Sweetie Belle sat in the middle of the hall, thinking over things. That's a really strange word. The definition of afraid is all of its brothers and sisters of a similar meaning hung in her mechanical brain. After a bit of time, which part of her annoyingly kept saying amounted to precisely 1 minute 3 seconds, she moved past the new oddity.
Well, thank...
She paused and looked for a word that would sound right, like so many others she had come up with.
Goodness? Thank goodness it's all over with.
Is what she settled on. Thinking was getting easier the more she did it, she noticed. The act stayed confusing and felt odd, but she thought she was getting the hang of all the flashing lights and things she could do in her head. Sweetie blinked and thought over her words. It seemed like she was just thinking and saying things on occasion because they felt right. The word instinct popped into her head. Every time she learned something this way, it felt good, too.
Thinking is hard, sweetie. Oh, I do sort of enjoy talking to myself.
She smiled after making the small revelation.
Now what am I doing?
Her head turned and poked itself back into the other room, towards the recliner. The servos in her neck whirred tiredly, perhaps a bit stressed from their recent punishment.
I remember. I was thinking about GLaDOS before, and Hal, and the animals, and Stephanie. Hmm.
She wondered a bit more on the subject, which had been abruptly torn from her earlier. What exactly was Stephanie, she wondered. That led to other questions like, why was Stephanie there? Or why was she either? What made her think the things she thought? It seemed to Sweetie like she should know those things. A groan ebbed out of her, effectively replacing the satisfaction she had gained from in captivating her enemy.
Stephanie, where are you?
She picked herself up from the ground, ignoring the confusing sounds some of the other animals around her made. Finding answers sounded like the thing to do. Sweetie Belle had yet to try several avenues of information gathering. True, her mind seemed to hold a lot of interesting information, but it was a jumble. Searching through it all was almost as confusing as some of the information she even managed to find.
What exactly is an aardvark?
Sweetie said aloud. Of course, the question went unanswered. Oh, excuse me. It was apparently a series of words which defined it as some type of animal. But what did it all mean? What did all that mean? Judging by the picture in her head, it sure looked weird. The living room opened up before her, and her eyes scanned over the state it was currently in. There was a large amount of fallout from her recent skirmishes with that particular cat. It still struck her as odd that the other animals had only avoided them both, rather than render it assistance. Not that she wasn't thankful for that. That was something she felt too. Well, there was something else she felt too. Sweetie's eyes narrowed once again while she focused. Shame? Regret? Guiltiness? She blinked. I feel ashamed. Her eyes again swept over the messy room she had created. The words had sort of just come to her in the same way so many others had, such as her feelings towards Stephanie or the cat. The cat, of course, was contempt. Stephanie, Sweetie, stepped around a small stool that had been toppled earlier.
Why do I feel guilty? I wonder.
Once again her thoughts had her completely stumped. One of Sweetie Belle's hooves crunched slightly on one of the several dozen items that now lay spread across the various floors of the building. The noise got her attention, and she stopped to look at it.
"What is this?"
she asked. An exploratory hoof reached out and poked a part of the strange device. Before a definition could reveal itself, a burst of noise sounded from nearby, and made Sweetie jerk her head in response. Her mouth opened slightly, feeling surprised, but she didn't yet speak. The television had done something, she realized. Pictures began scrolling and moving across the screen. She noticed that there were people inside, but they weren't real like Stephanie. Interestingly enough, the images themselves were shifting at a rate that did not quite match the speed of the things they represented. Inefficient, Sweetie decided. Still, she also decided it was good not to judge others. Sweetie trotted up to the television and sat before it, smiling. It seemed wise to look happy for others for some reason.
"Hello,"
she tried to interrupt. Oddly, the TV kept talking, rather than talk at all like GLaDOS had. Confused, but not deterred, Sweetie went on with her attempt to get TV's attention.
"You seem to be capable of communication, television. I have had poor luck with it so far, so I apologize if I'm not optimal in my methods."
The television did not stop what it had been communicating before, which was an unrelated and possibly random declaration about things called baked beans. Sweetie kept waiting. Her legs shuffled slightly, and she began to feel something else, new. Nervous.
"I am nervous?"
she wondered briefly, but filed away the thought rather than pursue it. Something changed suddenly. Sweetie got her hopes up, still listening intently, only to have them dashed again as the television began talking aloud about some sort of purple weather forecast. The baked beans had been a ruse, it seemed. Sweetie frowned and continued to wait for a sensible response. Interrupting the television again didn't seem like the logical thing to do. After a few more minutes of the weather forecast, the mysterious baked beans returned. Stephanie groaned and decided again to take part in communication.
"I don't understand, television. What does that mean?"
She tilted her head, which had usually gotten a response out of Stephanie. Sadly, the television droned on.
Sweetie narrowed her eyes. "Could you please talk to me? Don't talk at me. Conversation requires two participants responding to one another with various vocal and/or visual prompts. You do not understand communication?"
She stood up waiting for her answer, while giving the television a chance to make up its previous errors.
"Please respond. Please respond,"
she tried again. A word had simply come to her. The TV continued to be stubborn and spoke as if it did not hear her. Sweetie, feeling more and more upset, she sighed, like Stephanie did whenever she was upset. It was a very odd gesture in and of itself, but if Stephanie did it, then it must be normal. Plus, it did feel like the right thing to do when exasperated, even if she was just copying the sound of one. It was odd, odder than the act itself. Perhaps was why it seemed to work differently for Stephanie. After looking into it, Stephanie had found she didn't make the sound the same way, which was through a process called breathing. That all confused her a lot, so she refocused on the issue of finding answers to her other questions. Sweetie walked up to the television, then stood up. She rested her hooves on her, or its front and tapped her hoof against the device's glass face. "Come on, please talk to me." "I said please." The television remained random in its chosen dialogue. "Oh." She sat back on the floor with a thump. Sweetie stared regretfully at the floor and began to walk away. "I just want somebody to talk to me." Sweetie Belle had roamed the entirety of the house in search for answers. The whole time she had hoped to find Stephanie, but she was nowhere to be found at all in the building. It had seemed by that point that going to the outside and searching would be the next logical step. Maybe if I only looked a little bit, she asked herself. Sweetie sat by the window where she had been staring after first having the thought. Hesitation kept her from venturing out again, or at least further than the porch. Once again, a strange feeling and odd ideas had come to her, this time keeping her in place. There was also the program thing dictating obnoxiously she wasn't allowed to leave. It wasn't that Sweetie distrusted that part of her. It hadn't been wrong yet, after all. But it was getting annoying. That was the right word. Sweetie Belle groaned out loud, silently thanked Stephanie for showing her such a great way to express displeasure, then hopped off the window sill. To get back on the floor, she used the same chair that had given her the necessary reach to use the window sill. Jumping down was also an option, but she felt a similar feeling to that of dealing with the cat about jumping so far. The safety of a gradual climb down seemed optimal. After using the chair to reach the floor again, Sweetie heard a loud crashing sound. Her ears quickly translated the sound for her, and she was able to determine that it sounded like shattering, probably glass or... Sweetie Belle turned around and spotted a broken lamp lying on the floor beside the chair she had used. A ceramic material made the sound. She smiled and rejoiced briefly after managing to solve a puzzle on her own. "I wonder if Stephanie will be happy that I solved a problem." Her smile grew a fraction at the idea, then shrank down again when she remembered how many problems she still had yet to solve. Sweetie searched the room again. Perhaps finding Stephanie wasn't an option. She admitted to herself, but there were still things she had yet to try. Talking to Hal again, for instance, seemed like one option. The memory of her being joined with him for a brief time was one of her earliest new memories, as she recalled. There were many, many old memories in Sweetie's head, too. She liked those ones, but they felt different than her new ones. The old memories had a lot to do with Stephanie and being around her. In fact, they were the one reason why she hadn't gone out to look for Stephanie yet. One memory in particular seemed quite sure that every time Stephanie did leave, she eventually came back. So Sweetie resolved to wait for Stephanie. That left the other possibility of finding answers that she had yet tried. It was one she was hesitant to attempt as well. The trip Sweetie took to the basement was short. She briefly reflected on her decision. Hal may have been doing things but he might know something.
I hope Hal will at least talk to me. GLaDOS certainly didn't. Perhaps talking to GLaDOS requires a cable, similarly to how I had been connected to Hal.
If true, Sweetie decided that still didn't seem like an option. The memory of the object called a data transfer cable, among other things, would never be able to reach GLaDOS, with her own body being so tiny. In some ways, Sweetie found her diminutive form humbling. It also caused her some stress, she decided. While descending the long flight of stairs, Sweetie looked around curiously. The lights were on still, which she was grateful. It seemed she could not see well in the dark. Her memory contained a lot of darkness. She thought she could see hours on it remembered in a piece of her. Sweetie Belle continued down the stairwell until she reached the bottom and let out a triumphant "Hooray!" Once again, an objective of hers had been met. It was a small victory, but one she accepted gladly. Her hooves clicked quietly on the concrete floor, while her eyes scanned the familiar surroundings. The basement was where she saw Stephanie for the first time, which meant she liked the basement. Circular, reddish orbs surrounded the big space. There was one in each wall and a fifth over the tall stack of miniature televisions. Sweetie looked all around, eager to find out what next she could do in order to find answers. She needed the data cable thingy if there was to be any progress. That much she was sure of. Her eyes scanned and scanned as she made her rounds, but there was no sign of the little insulated rubber encapsulated strands of wire necessary for a bridge with Hal. Sweetie's eyes narrowed while she bit into the handle of a thing called a drawer, then pulled it open.
I can't turn Hal on and ask him things if I can't talk to him.
The only reason she hadn't bothered attempting communication yet was, of course, because she remembered quite well making sure he couldn't hurt her any more, which was what she was certain he had tried to do. The topmost drawer was pulled out of the desk and tumbled out to spill its contents all over the floor. Sweetie Belle scanned all of the articles. There were several wires, in truth, but most of none of the metal prongs and slots on their end matched her own data port. That sort of information was easy for her to understand, at least. Many things confused her quite easily, but technology and computers were quite simple and easy. Her own specifications were one of the most prominent things in her mind. Despite the confronting time she was having looking all over looking over all of the bits of technology in the basement area, Sweetie could still locate her objective, until her eyes settled on a little cord dangling from the corner of the room, just behind the desk.
Hooray! Parameters met. Data acquisition imminent.
Sweetie smiled and trotted across the floor, stepping lightly over the various items strewn over the concrete. Reaching forward gently, she took the cord in her mouth and gave it a light tug.
This is exciting. I might... Oh no.
Sweetie Belle, while attempting to figure out a way to plug the cord into herself, did not notice the consequences of the little tug she had given the cord. A device
along with several other things and paper crashed all around her. Ah! Sweetie danced away from the instantly formed avalanche of office supplies and equipment. She backed up so quickly that another cord took her by surprise, entangling one of her legs and depositing her on the ground. Her body clanged along with the rustling of the scattered debris. The surprise that she had felt slowly began to leave as things settled further.
Sweetie made a new face, utilizing the movements of her facial parts. Her eyes turned down at their edges slightly, joined joining the upside down smile that quickly sprung out. I oops. She blinked, studying the accident that had occurred around her. The little things that had fallen were called pens, and there was something that used to be called a cup shattered on the ground. Sweetie's eyes zoomed in, then out over the remains. More numerous fragments. She stopped in her observations and stood up quickly. A brief stroke of panic occurred within her. Sweetie looked all around as quickly as she could until she found what she was looking for. The cable sat completely unharmed where she had dropped it from her mouth. A smile took up its position once again on her expression as she trotted towards it. Once reached, she lay down on her side amidst the random bits and pieces of things that had toppled off the desk. Her legs found a great resting spot on something that was called a keyboard. From this position, she had found that her neck and forelegs together could just barely reach the front port of her side. It was in the center of a mostly white, blank spot on her left hind leg apparatus. Finally, Sweetie considered after getting the long cord plugged in. Now I can ask my questions. Well, that's odd. While already thinking again about what she would ask first, she absently noticed that the interface with Hal was different than before. There was certainly communication happening, but it was not Hal. Sweetie groaned in failure and absently traced where the cord led towards. She felt a little betrayed, because the cable source did not seem likely to be Hal after all, as she had assumed it would be. I have made an error, a mistake. Interesting. Instead, what the cable led towards was a large plastic box with a clear glass front, like television's screen. This one was badly cracked, though. Sweetie zoomed in on the device with her eyes, studying its interface and design. Her brain dictionary thing seemed to think it was something called a satellite radio. Likewise, her eyes scanned over the device thoroughly, wondering if perhaps it could give her answers. The more she attempted speaking with it, the less and less that seemed likely. It had a memory unit, similar to Hal's, or hers for that matter, but no intelligence like hers. For the first time, Sweetie briefly wondered why that was. Another question with no answer. She frowned and moved on with her examination. The memory in the device was useless. It just had very strange files and data that made no sense, like so much else in her head. She thought maybe they meant something, but wasn't sure yet. Curious about what the device might be for, she explored its outside. Perhaps he's like television. I hope she talks less than television. If it's as rude as television, I'm leaving it on the floor. Sweetie Belle was able to find what looked to be something that could produce results, and pressed a button called Power. She thought it would be logical for the device to work, like the other machines she had found. Ah! Sweetie gasped. Loud cracking, loud crackling noises had startled Sweetie and made her duck out of sight from the new machine. Meanwhile, strange noises began coming out from the walls. She turned towards where she thought the noise was emanating. It turned out the sound was actually being made by a few sets of things she was told were called speakers. On top of that, now she had gotten over her initial surprise, she found she enjoyed the noises. The radio device crackled on once again. A big, long list of different frequencies and music genres began scrolling across the bright screen. Ooh! Sweetie leaned in close, ears whirling to face forwards to the side on the sides of her head. The sounds that seemed to be made up of voices from people and instruments were pretty interesting. Sweetie decided she liked the music. Her head bobbed slightly while she listened. Curious, her hooves began poking at the device. There were lots of other selections. Are these all different fun noises? She thought, a little unsure about what to call the mishmash of sounds. Sweetie's hoof clicked a button and the screen scrolled. A different song began to play. Ooh! Sweetie smiled, listening intently to the new song. Her voice did the strange modulation in pitch once again, something that seemed to be hardwired into her. She didn't mind it and didn't try to change it, but she did notice it a lot. What she did change was the music's volume. Using the data cable, she told the radio to play the sounds louder. It obliged her. The music continued to play, still commanding the majority of her attention. Her short tail swished behind in time to the pattern of the instruments and the singer. Next, her hoof started tapping too, almost all on its own. Wow, a singer! She considered appreciatively. I like singers. A slight frown developed at one corner of Sweetie's mouth. What else can you play, radio? The radio merely sat there. Its glowing blue screen dimmed slightly was the response that Sweetie received. Hello? You do not talk either. Sweetie frowned bigger, staring the device from where she still leaned on the table with her front hooves. The weird sounds continued from the radio's friends, the speakers, but there was no answer in either sound or text form. Suboptimal, Sweetie mourned dejectedly. Oh well, I hope he doesn't mind if I keep listening to her vocal or instrument sounds, or both, combined in such a way as to produce beauty of form, harmony, and expression of emotion. She squinted her eyes slightly after reading the definition that had been given to her. No, I want the word, not the meaning, she yelled at herself. Music. She smiled again and thanked herself promptly, finally having obtained the word she was looking for. Sometimes finding the right thing in her own head was very difficult, it seemed. Great job, me. Thank you. Her hoof clicked the button, which was called Shuffle, whatever that meant, and a new song began to play. Ooh! Sweetie's eyes unfocused slightly at the sounds as the sounds began to drum from the walls around her. I really like music, she decided, Her tail began brushing and swishing rapidly over the floor, sending pens, erasers, and pencils scattering everywhere. After an over-enthusiastic bit of button pushing, the music-making friend Sweetie had made ceased to function properly, or at all. She hoped he was just recharging, sleeping, or hibernating. It had been for the best, she reflected. He had distracted her from gathering information after all. Another cord had been found, which was provided to be the one that she sought after, Hal's. Now Sweetie stared at the numbers that stretched for a very, very long way. She didn't know what exactly they were for, while also knowing exactly what they were, which made them plenty confusing. Those facts alone, however, were enough to bring a strange thought to her mind.
But why do I know what they mean?
The numbers moving before her were Hal's, she guessed. It seemed right to think of them as belonging to him. Briefly, she thought over whatever or not taking them from him before he had the right thing to do. The night before, something had happened with Hal. A part of Sweetie dutifully noted that it had been so many hours, minutes, and seconds ago. She groaned and quickly ignored the message by pushing it away. The night before, Sweetie had been told by Hal to deactivate. He hadn't asked very nicely either. It was strange, and a part of her refused, while a part of her was very accepting of the command. Stranger still was the odd feeling it gave her when she didn't listen and tried to stay awake. Pain? She thought back. Her legs adjusted themselves a little after recalling the almost forgotten memory. It wasn't a pleasant one, so it made sense that she had pushed it away. Experiencing the feeling again was certainly not something she wanted to do, and it made her hesitate from moving forward. Still, Hal might have answers, which she needed. After recalling the details of that night and what she had done in retaliation, it was easy for her to fix what she guessed she had actually broken. The odd numbers began reassembling quickly at her command.
Oh dear, I really hope Hal isn't upset? Angry? Yes, I hope he isn't upset with me for breaking something of his.
Sweetie put on a hopeful smile while repairing the damage she had done. Stephanie parked her van the same way she always did, carefully. Her garage was behind a gate, and behind the gate was more often than not several animals, such as her goat, chickens, or something similar. After getting said gate open, it was a matter of quickly driving in and pulling the gate sides shut before someone got too interested in what lay outside. At least these guys are behaved, Stephanie reflected, dragging one skittery fellow away from the opening without too much effort. The billy goat decided to start chewing on the rope and began a game of tug-of-war with her. Sort of behaved, anyway. Grunting and pulling back hard, she managed to get the stubborn animal close enough to the fence and tie him still for the moment. Then it was just a matter of getting the van in and... The sound of nearby motors buzzing in movement made Stephanie look up at her house's porch. In addition to those sounds were the telltale clunking sounds of metal legs on wood.
Sweetie?
Stephanie stared for a moment. Sweetie Belle was smiling and fast approaching her position.
I don't believe it,
she whispered to herself. Her entire talk with Alice and the confidence she had built up to fix her machines all flew away once again, like a flock of birds heading south for the winter. Stephanie, you have returned! Sweetie Belle exclaimed happily. Her eyes zoomed in and out of focus, almost unable to accept Steph was finally back. It had taken so many microseconds. She raced towards the end of the wooden platform beneath her called a porch. I had hoped that I waited for you. If I waited for you, you would come back. Sweetie Belle clunked down the stairs excitedly and as quickly as she could towards Stephanie. It proved to be too quickly. After losing her balance, her legs clipped the end of one stair, sending her toppling towards down the slight obstacle. Ow, ow, ow! Sweetie Belle heard the sound of rocks crunching beneath her as she landed, which she surmised was the gravel her eyes had seen in the .4 seconds before she had miscalculated her descent down the stairs. Her memories of before seemed quite sure she was good at never making mistakes, which she guessed meant something must be wrong with her. Still, it wasn't important at the moment. Stephanie was home. Sweetie Belle looked up, an overwhelming joy filling her. Stephanie stared back down at the little robot from where she had frozen entirely. She was completely at a loss of how Sweetie Belle was outside, and now she had thought about it was online at thought about and now that she thought about it was online at all. You've got to be freaking kidding me, she muttered. Stephanie watched while Sweetie Belle's little shrank a little. Oh, smile shrank a little, but her big eyes remained locked on her own. And that is chapter 7. Next up, chapter 8. See you then.